Hello and welcome to another special edition of the Newsmakers, coming to you from TRT World Forum here in Istanbul, where global thinkers and leaders come together to discuss some of the most contentious issues in the world. One of those is Hong Kong, something we've covered very closely here on the Newsmakers. The chief executive, Carrie Lam, caught between Beijing and the needs and wants of her people and protesters on the streets who are refusing to budge. I sat down with her predecessor, Leung, who faced what could possibly be described as a forerunner to those protests. And CY Leung joins us now on the program. Sir, pleasure having you on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
5 years ago, you were in a similar position to Carrie Lam. Do you find many striking similarities? Does it feel like déjà vu for you?
Well, there's one key similarity, and this is the people 5 years ago in the so-called Occupy Central movement, which was an emulation of copycat of Occupy Wall Street movement. And the people, the protesters and rioters today, in the past 4 months, both want what they call full democracy in Hong Kong. Let me explain why we do not have and cannot have their brand of full democracy in Hong Kong. Hong Kong is not a sovereign country. We are a city of China, and you could only compare the processes and the structure of democracy to those in, say, London, Paris, New York, or Tokyo. In all these other cities in other parts of the world, the local governments headed by, say, a mayor, elected by the people in full democracy style, let's say by one man, one vote, universal suffrage, do not have the high degree of autonomy that we in Hong Kong enjoy. The chief executive of Hong Kong and the government that he or she lead has much higher levels of authority compared to the mayors and the city governments in other cities in other parts of the world. Why is that? It is because upon election held locally, the elected candidate has the additional authorization, devolvement of power by the Chinese government, the central government in Beijing. You add the two together, you have what would otherwise be a low level of autonomy. You have high degree of autonomy, and therefore you can't cast aside the central government in Beijing. And this is exactly what the demonstrators, the rioters 5 years ago and those today want to achieve. They basically say, trust it to the Hong Kong people. You don't have to exercise your substantive power of appointment. You don't have to worry about how we change the method of the election in Hong Kong. That's not on, because the method of selecting and electing chief executive and the entire political structure and also relationship between Hong Kong and the central government in Beijing have all been spelled out clearly. Firstly, in the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1984, and then in the Basic Law that was promulgated, passed into law in 1990.
Right. You say we do not have a system of one man, one vote. Okay. But when you say we cannot, that's at the heart of it. Why can't you? If you reach a point where the vast majority of people say we want universal suffrage, this is life. This is how countries evolve.
You can't have your cake and eat it. Let me first clarify. It is in the Basic Law that says the ultimate goal is to have one man, one vote in Hong Kong. And that would still involve Beijing, firstly to approve the change of the method of the election. Today we have the election committee election, and going forward, when we reach that final goal, we have universal suffrage. But you need the National People's Congress approval of that. And also, the Basic Law says very clearly that you need to have a nomination committee to nominate candidates before the candidates face the electorate in Hong Kong. Now, that's what the protesters in the Occupy Central movement 4 years ago could not accept. When I was chief executive, that offer was actually on the table. It was in accordance with the Basic Law, namely nomination by a broadly representative nomination committee and then the election by the people. And that was turned down.
Right.
by the so-called pro-democracy.
Why do you say so-called
legislators.
pro-democracy?
Well, because the kind of democracy that they are demanding is not the democracy that Hong Kong as a city, under this unique arrangement of one country, two systems, and under the provisions of our basic law, which are a constitutional document, provide for.
You said protesters and rioters. How do you apportion the percentages here? Would you say the vast majority are protesters and maybe a small amount are rioters?
The small percentage are rioters. Normally what happened has become part of a pattern. If you look at yesterday, for example, you have unlawful assembly demonstrations by, say, tens of thousands of people, and then as soon as darkness takes over at night, you have probably in the low hundreds of rioters who attack shops, other commercial establishments, and railway stations.
Out of their 5 demands, is there anything you would accept if you were still chief executive?
Well, I can't say it on behalf of the chief executive, but we have to do everything according to law. Where there's a question of the arrests and bringing to justice of the rioters, or whether universal suffrage, you have to do it according to law. And we have rule of law in Hong Kong. We're well known for that, and that's why we are a global financial center, and a major one at that. And we also have an independent judiciary. Many of our top judges are from common law jurisdictions from other countries, from Western countries such as the UK, Canada, Australia, and so on.
The simplest one seems to be an independent inquiry into alleged police brutality. I know videos can be faked, but we've seen videos of police beating people up, roughing them up. That's one of their demands. That one you can tick off very easily. Yes, independent inquiry to see whether some police might have done terrible things.
Well, we have an existing mechanism to look into all kinds of complaints. I mean, the reason why we should not have an independent commission of inquiry has been explained by the chief executive and also by her secretary for justice. Time and again, that point has been made. I think the protesters and rioters are just making it difficult for the government so that they could carry on.
The longer this carries on, the more the likelihood of potential militancy. Militancy in terms of torching the subway, for example. Doesn't that play into the hands of the chief executive to say that, you see, these people are just rioters?
I don't want to use the expression of who is playing into the hands of who, but let me just sound this note of caution, which I did about 10 days ago in Morocco when I attended a similar international conference. I do not wish it on any other country in the world, but the tactics used by the rioters and the protesters in Hong Kong as well, for example, using the internet to mobilize very quickly a reasonably sizable crowd to attack, for example, railway stations or to blockade the roads leading to airports, are being replicated in places like Barcelona and London. So I think the world, that includes Western governments who seem to take a dim view of the response of the Hong Kong police force and the Hong Kong government, they should reflect on this very simple question. What would the police force of these countries and these governments do in response to similar incidents in their own countries?
5 years ago, you said that this was not entirely a domestic movement, that it wasn't entirely homegrown. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you were suggesting that foreigners were involved here.
Let me just say this. You probably have seen video footages of foreigners, Westerners, Caucasians, not only in the streets during riots. I'm not even talking about demonstrations. I'm talking about riots in the streets, communicating with rioters.
But you think the same is happening now?
I didn't see them 5 years ago. I'm seeing them today. You see video footages of them today.
But a lot of Caucasians live in Hong Kong,
of course,
right?
And many of them are of unknown identities. So Let me just leave you and your audience with this question mark. We do not know who they are. Yes, we do have so-called expatriates living and working in Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is a very small society, particularly when we have expatriates working in limited sectors, for example, for professional services, financial services, and so on. And you know how easy nowadays it is for people on the internet to identify each other. And so far, we have not been able to identify them.
So who do you think's behind it?
Well, I don't want to speculate, but let me just respond to your question with these observations. Yes, we do have foreigners whom we do not recognize during demonstrations and riots.
And connected to that, you feel it's entirely justified to have the face mask ban?
The justification of a face mask ban and the need for it are all well rehearsed in other countries, in certain states in the United States, in some European countries. And that's just using the same approach to deal with similar incidents.
So protesters are thinking, well, Beijing wants to recognize our faces and put us in a database, and maybe one day, especially since at the genesis of all of this with the extradition law, right? They want to take us and disappear us to mainland China.
Never happened before. In the past 4 or 5 months, people have been sort of accusing fingers at Beijing. But let's ask ourselves, so far, what has Beijing done to Hong Kong? Both the leadership in Beijing and the chief executive and her colleagues in Hong Kong have said time again, and no one has been able to disprove what they said or challenge what they said, namely this fugitives ordinance amendment bill was actually initiated by the Hong Kong government and not Beijing. And interestingly, we already have had similar arrangements with 2 dozen or so other jurisdictions outside of China for.
So the mechanism with which the face mask ban was enacted was the Emergency Regulations Ordinance, colonial era. You would have known the power of this. Does this give Carrie Lam a lot of power to do a lot of things without accountability in a testing time?
The law has been there for the right reasons for a long time. And the laws that were pre-existent before the changeover in 1997 were all examined by the legislature before they transited over to the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region for them to remain as laws of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region.
The protesters worry, what will she use it for next? It's justifiable, isn't it?
Yes, as you said.
Their fear is justifiable, isn't it?
Well,
she's used it for this thing, maybe she'll use it for another thing and another thing.
It is law in Hong Kong. Many other countries have similar provisions. It's not the sort of law that you would use every day. We have not used it for 22 years. But we haven't had the kind of challenges to law and order, to the ordinary lives of Hong Kong people on a daily basis that we face in the past 4 or 5 months.
They are not backing down, the protesters. So what do you do then?
Well, we're seeing some protesters backing out, and therefore, if we look at the past few weekends, we are seeing the size of demonstrations and riots trending down, although we are seeing some lone wolves revving up the intensity of their violent actions.
Should we be in a situation now, all these months down the line, where Carrie Lam is having a dialogue with the people who are on the streets? Why aren't we seeing this?
Well, she had one. Dialogue is a good word. Dialogue means a two-way flow of ideas and its objectives, aspirations, and possibly apprehensions. So it should be a two-way thing. We have listened to the people who are in the streets, but I think the government should, at the same time, spell out very clearly to the people of Hong Kong what to do.
In the first place, then.
Well, it was proposed for a very simple reason, namely we did not have, and we still do not have, this arrangement between Hong Kong and Taiwan, which is part of China. There was a single murder case involving a Hong Kong person, and the Hong Kong person had since returned to Hong Kong. So it wasn't even between Hong Kong and the mainland China, it was between Hong Kong and Taiwan. That was to be covered as the different parts of China as a country. And as I said, Hong Kong had before this initiative, arrangements with 20 plus other jurisdictions. I shouldn't name them. Some of these jurisdictions in the minds of your viewers might have in their regard a lower level of rule of law compared to the mainland of China.
Right. But was it a good decision to remove the extradition law because it would pull the rug from underneath the feet of the protesters politically? Or was it the right decision to remove it because principally it was not a good law?
Politics is the art of the possible. It was not possible after protesters came out and basically told the Hong Kong government, for good or wrong, good or bad reasons, we don't want this piece of law. It was not possible to have it passed in the Legislative Council.
So if politics is the art of the possible and a million people are on the streets saying we want universal suffrage, why can't you make it possible?
The law, the basic law.
Laws change?
The constitutional arrangement with China will become separatism. I don't think if you spell it out to the people of Hong Kong that if you insist on having this kind of universal suffrage, and namely retaining the high degree of autonomy of the Hong Kong Chief Executive, the government that he leads, and Hong Kong as a special administrative region, casting at the same time, Beijing aside, Hong Kong will become a separate part of China. If we explain that to the people clearly, I don't think the people in Hong Kong would accept it.
Tell me what kind of threat there is from Beijing if the chief executive said, yeah, okay, we're going to pave the way to universal suffrage. What happens?
I don't want to term it in the context of threats. You do not have any component of a sovereign state, let's say a city or province, that would have this kind of high degree of autonomy and at the same time taking away the power, the appointment power, etc., of the central government. But if that was that became the norm, instead of having 200 countries on this planet, you probably end up with 200,000.
So is one country, two systems going to become one country, one system sooner than we think?
Absolutely not. One country, two systems is no longer just a concept. The basic law, which contains 160 written articles, was promulgated in 1990, and since 1997 it's been fully practiced. So if anyone suggests for a moment that Hong Kong is not having one country, two systems, but one country, one system, I would humbly suggest that that person point his or her finger to any particular article that is not being enforced in Hong Kong.
So Beijing swallowing up Hong Kong wholly anytime soon will never happen, in your opinion?
There's no reason why Beijing wants to swallow up Hong Kong. If Beijing had wanted to swallow up Hong Kong, it could have done in 1982 when Deng Xiaoping met Margaret Thatcher in Beijing.
What's your message to the protesters, those who are still out on the streets, those who will not back down until they feel at least their voices are heard when it comes to universal suffrage, when it comes to opening a dialogue to universal suffrage and one man, one vote?
Follow the law. Follow the basic law, read the provisions regarding democratic developments in Hong Kong, read the chapter on political structure, read the chapter on the relationship between Hong Kong and the central authorities in Beijing, and follow the law in Hong Kong. Do not break the law. Do not turn the lives of ordinary people in Hong Kong upside down.
But aren't they ordinary people?
They are ordinary people, but there are also larger numbers of ordinary people who have their lives to lead in Hong Kong.
Would you have done anything differently to Carrie Lam if you were in her position?
I shouldn't compare as a former chief executive with what I would have done and what's being done by my successor.
Do you endorse everything she's done?
I shouldn't say that.
Has she led well?
Well, I do not comment on the work of my successors, but there's one single very important message, and this is both the government and the people should follow the laws in Hong Kong, and that includes the basic law. As far as this is concerned, the government and the chief executive leading the government has been doing.
CY Leung, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, at the TRT World Forum, we just heard Hong Kong's former chief executive tell me, despite allegations of brutality, he believes police have been responding appropriately to the tactics used by anti-government protesters. So, to respond to that, we've come back to the studio to speak to pro-democracy politician and activist Emily Lau, who joins me now from Taipei. Good to have you back on the program, ma'am. Your reaction to CY Leung?
Of course, I disagree with CY. I have disagreed with him for many years. And if you had seen the footage of the police beating people up, beating the protesters up, beating even innocent bystanders up, you would know that the police brutality is one of the main cause why we have this continuing protests.
He believes that Hong Kong has the mechanisms to investigate itself and to bring to account those people if there are excesses and injustices. Does it?
No, I don't think the mechanism is credible. I have myself been to the United Nations to attend hearings of the Human Rights Committee, and they have repeatedly called on Hong Kong to set up a truly independent commission to investigate the police, have the power to investigate and to dish out sanctions. But they turned this down many years. So I think it is really, there's a consensus in Hong Kong amongst many reasonable people that the police investigating themselves is totally inadequate and it's not credible.
Okay, when it comes to the overall sentiment of those people on the streets, particularly those who will not stop until they get universal suffrage, he's absolutely clear. He says that's just not going to happen. It's impossible because it's the law. Universal suffrage is separatism. That's how he sees it. That's how the current chief executive sees it. So what happens from here on in then?
Well, actually, of course we can have universal suffrage under Chinese sovereignty within the basic law. I think the basic law does provide for people to have genuine elections to choose the leaders of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. So CY Leung is talking a lot of nonsense. And many academics and activists have argued it is possible. And it's not true that many protesters are fighting for independence. There is no color revolution. And maybe we cannot achieve universal suffrage very quickly. But one thing that many people want, including those in the business community, in civil society, is to set up an independent commission of inquiry to look into the whole saga, not just investigating the police brutality, but to investigate the whole thing. If CY Leung said there have been foreign interference, he said it for many years. And up to today, he has not been able to produce any evidence. But let this inquiry look into all of it. And why? Why would the government not respond, not accept such a legitimate request?
Well, you heard my interview with him. If the young protesters had to hear that interview, how would they respond? Angrily?
Well, he's talking a lot of rubbish. And well, anyway, he's the past. So forget about CY Leung. I think we want to focus on the present and the future. And many Hong Kong people want the situation to dial down, to de-escalate. And one thing that would help is to set up this independent commission of inquiry. I think many people will be prepared to say, okay, let's calm down. Let this inquiry start. And let's, try to seek an end to this weeks, days, months of unrest.
Right. And having spoken to CY Leung, having spoken to Ronnie Tong and others, it seems as if there's a massive discrepancy between what the protesters want and what a lot of the people in power, or those who used to be in power and who side with Carrie Lam, believe is the limits of Hong Kong's freedom. They see the fact that there's an absolute ceiling to the political freedoms of the people of Hong Kong under China, and they almost talk about a sense of naivety from the protesters. Tell me what's going on there.
Well, of course, the protesters are not naive. And it is absolutely true that many Hong Kong people want to preserve our freedoms, our personal safety, and the rule of law under Chinese sovereignty. But China has to respond by showing that it is willing to do it. And what the scenes that the whole world is seeing day and night is this fight between David and Goliath. But the Davids, they are not going to stop. And is the Goliath going to crush us and to ruin Hong Kong? And you are not right in saying that the people in establishment have a big divide with us, because many people in the establishment camp, they also support the setting up of the Commission of Inquiry. So there are 80% of Hong Kong people, according to many opinion polls, which show that is a way out.
Well, to his point earlier, that if Goliath wanted to crush David, it would have done it already.
Well, it is maybe giving us a slow crush, slow death. If they continue like this, some business people have said, this has gone on for now over 4 months. Hong Kong cannot survive for another 4 months like this, because many hotels are empty, the restaurants are empty, the shops are empty. And there's going to be a rising unemployment very soon. Why do we want to reduce Hong Kong to that state? Because just a few months ago, Hong Kong was a very peaceful, very safe and prosperous city. And Carrie Lam and people like C.Y. Leung, they are, in the Chinese expression, sinners for 1,000 years.
Emily Lau, good to talk to you again. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers.